Yeah, okay, so thank you very much, Jessica, for opening this symposium and then get over our technical difficulties. So today, yeah, I'll try and talk a little bit about some of my work on modeling the impact of defects in solids. Okay, so okay, great. So just to give a very brief introduction to anyone who's not totally familiar with what I mean by defects. So defects are these atomic level impurities in the arrangement of atoms in materials. So you can have things like vacancies, so missing atoms, substitutions, or interstitials, additional atoms in a lattice. And so the presence of these defects, whether unintentionally or intentionally, in which case we usually call them dopants in materials, can drastically impact their overall properties across many different functional material applications. And so these defects, despite the fact that they always have a positive formation enthalpy, so you can see in the graph on the right, the H here is positive, and this is because they cost energy to form in terms of breaking bonds or forming more unfavorable bonds. They also come with this strong configurational entropy contribution, so TS here in this plot. And so what you find is that essentially at some point these two contributions cancel out or counterbalance each other, and we get this minimum in the Gibbs free energy at a certain finite concentration of defects. And just kind of thinking about why do we have this configurational entropy contribution? Well, if we think about having a fully ordered, perfect crystalline material, and we add just one defect to that material, there's many different possible sites at which we could place that defect, which would all be symmetry equivalent. And so the fact that we have this extremely large multiplicity, okay, gives us this strong configurational entropy contribution. And so if we kind of work out the maths from this graph, we end up with this formula here on the right for the defect concentration, where we see that it's exponentially dependent on this formation energy with temperature underneath. And so we can see on the left plot here that this means that our defect concentrations are extremely sensitive to this formation energy. So even relatively small changes in it here can give huge changes in our predicted defect concentrations.
Sure. So I've got a message from the audience, I mean in Zoom. So that it's better to use a mouse pointer. So
okay, yeah, I tried. Yeah,
yeah. So sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. Unfortunately, it's not one of the fancy ones that kind of automatically does it. But yeah, I'll try and use the one here.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Okay, so just before digging in a bit more into some of these calculations and how we do them, I just wanted to, before I forget, advertise this paper that has just gone online, I think as of yesterday or the day before. So this is a perspective that we wrote an invited review paper on essentially doing defect simulations in materials and trying to focus on some of the pitfalls that we often see in doing defect simulations, and also with a look towards trying to, as a field, encourage greater reproducibility, which we think is particularly important now with some of the advent of data-driven and machine learning approaches in this field. So just if you're at all interested in this space, it might be worth a look at that. Okay, so as I mentioned, defects can be really important for many different material applications. This is just to kind of flash some of the key ones, transistors, transparent conducting materials, solar cells, now a lot more for quantum information science and more. Okay, so how do we actually go about calculating point defects? Well, the most common approach is this so-called supercell approach, where we start with the primitive structure of our host material. From this, we make a supercell, which ideally should be large enough to avoid significant defect-defect interactions in neighboring periodic images. With that, we then create the different types of defects that we want to calculate. So, for example, vacancy we can create by just removing one atom like this. We could also do other types of defects, so substitutions or swapped anti-site pairs. We can also have things like interstitials, like an additional atom within the lattice of our material. Essentially, so with this initial defect structure, we then relax the structure to obtain a ground state or equilibrium geometry. And then finally, we can calculate the formation energy or the essentially single point energy of this relaxed structure. and from that compute the formation energy. And so to compute the formation energy is very simple. We just take the energy difference of our defective supercell compared to that of the bulk or pristine defect-free supercell. We do have some additional corrections to add in here, such as finite size charge corrections to account for any long range charge effects from a defect, and also chemical potential corrections to account for the fact that we've added or removed atoms to create this defect. Okay. So one of the issues with this approach, however, and something that I've looked at quite a bit in my research, is the fact that when we create our initial defect structure in this way, so the very simple approach of just removing an atom to create a vacancy or adding an atom to create an interstitial, there's no guarantee that when we do this gradient-based energy relaxation, that we'll actually end up with the ground state geometry. So if we have something like this, where on our defect structural potential energy surface here, so here where y is energy and our x-axis is some structural coordinate, often we might actually be closer to this local minimum on the potential energy surface, so that when we do this ionic geometry optimization, we end up in this local minimum, or essentially a metastable structure, which may not reflect the true defect behavior. Reminding ourselves of the fact that, as we saw earlier, this defect concentration is exponentially dependent on the formation energy. The higher formation energies that you will end up with if this happens can also lead to quite spurious predictions, where maybe you underestimate your defect concentration by several orders of magnitude. More generally, beyond formation energies and the derived properties there, such as I said, concentrations, doping, thermodynamic effects. The defect structure is also important for things like localization, so whether the defect is a deep or a shallow type of defect, whether it has strong or weak recombination activity, migration behavior, catalytic activity, and more. So essentially, we can say that essentially all properties of our defect are derived in some way from its geometry. So of course, I'm not the first to notice this behavior. So the importance of defect geometries and potential metastabilities has been noticed previously in literature. So these are just some examples. But the point is that whenever this had been noticed before, it was essentially always what we would call serendipitously, so just by chance, so luck discoveries, or from some sort of manual searching that was performed after initial theoretical predictions strongly disagreed with some known experimental behavior. So people went back looking for it. I think something that's just maybe interesting to note is, well, why is this not an issue for bulk crystal structure optimization? So why is this just something unique to defects? And I would say that, well, generally when we're relaxing a bulk crystal structure, of course, we have a good initial guess of what the structure is from experimental databases, such as the ICSD, which basically starts at gradient optimization close enough to the global minimum that we don't need to worry about this behavior. The thing is, for unknown crystal structure prediction, so predicting the crystal structure of a chemical composition that hasn't actually been made experimentally before, this is indeed a huge avenue of research, a huge scientific problem, and many different approaches have been trialed for that. And so the thing is, defects are actually unknown structures. So we have no database of known defect structures yet. And so this is essentially, I would say, the reason why these efficient structure searching techniques are required for defects. Caveat to that is that I will say that defect structures are at least a bit more constrained in terms of the configurational space than we would have with a totally brand new crystal structure. But essentially, it's the same issue of actually going into a totally unknown energy landscape. So with that in mind, at one point, I had the goal of developing a method that was both accurate and efficient in navigating this defect configuration landscape and identifying ground state metastable defect structures. For time today, I'm going to skip over a little bit of some of the core details, just so I can cover some more interesting points. But essentially, it involves two main steps of local bond distortions around the defect site with some level of what we call chemical guidance or chemical intelligence to try and do this as efficiently as possible, and followed by rattling, so essentially noise, constrained noise in our atomic positions to break symmetry. We also find that doing this really helps in aiding the location of global minimum. So this gives us this kind of mesh of trial distortion structures, which we then relax using a reliable level of theory. So typically that's hybrid DFT when it comes to semiconductors, by using cheap, coarse numerical parameters to help the calculations run efficiently. And then finally, we'll end up with something like this, where we can see that for a certain distortion range, our distortions have been sufficient to push us over this energy barrier and into the energy well of our ground state structure. So in summary, the strategy with ShakeNBreak is to try and use this coarse exploration of the potential energy surface to identify potential locally stable defect structures before continuing with the final converged energy calculations. We found the method to be extremely and surprisingly successful, particularly given some of its simplicity at the core. And then by applying it to a wide and diverse range of materials, we've actually seen that this is quite a widespread behavior for defect solids, and we've actually seen it to occur for defect in every material that we've looked at so far. Okay, so let's skip over some of the key examples just for time, but the two key lessons I want to say that we've been able to extract the behavior of defects from our and other people's usage of ShakeNBreak in the literature over the past couple of years. I would say one of the key conclusions is that we've now seen that metastable defects, or this metastability at defects that ShakeNBreak has really helped reveal, can actually be very important for these electron-hole recombination processes. So when defects capture electrons or holes non-radiatively, so through phonon emission or absorption, the presence of metastable defects can actually act to really catalyze these processes, because they essentially open up these alternative pathways for these cycles to occur. So instead of just capturing, between two possible defect structures, you now can have these intermediate metastable states, which really catalyze these processes. One other area that we've found ShakeNBreak to be useful is actually beyond defects, but looking at other types of localized species, such as polarons or self-trapped excitons, that of course have quite a lot of similar behavior to defects. And so one example of this was how we used it to explain some of this unusual, extremely thermally sensitive emission lifetimes of self-trapped excitons in some of these vacancy-ordered perovskite materials, which has been shown to be very useful for some of these remote thermal imaging applications. Okay, so moving on, I just wanted to briefly mention this toolkit Doped, which I've developed, which is essentially this comprehensive defect simulation package, which provides a robust platform to manage the full defect simulation workflow, all the way from efficiently generating and enumerating defects in an appropriate supercell and their potential charge states, through to generating input files for our calculations and parsing the results, performing various types of finite size corrections, computing chemical potentials and their associated limits, and then through to full thermodynamic analyses, so looking at defect concentrations under a range of different possible synthesis or treatment conditions, doping limits, and more. Okay. So fortunately, there are far too many features in Dope to actually be able to really discuss today. But what I will say is that we've worked hard to put together these comprehensive documentation sites, so both for Dope and ShakeNBreak, to really help users get the most out of these codes. So we have many different tutorials going all the way from a basic defect workflow through to more advanced defect analyses, tips and tricks for common pitfalls, some YouTube and Bilibili video tutorials, extensive code API documentation, and more. So really trying to make the code as useful as possible, both for new defect researchers as well as advanced defect practitioners. So yeah, please do have a look at these websites if you're interested. I will say that our general design philosophies for these codes has been to try and make them as powerful, but also as flexible as possible, as well as being user-friendly, so that they can be used and tailored for all different kinds of defect investigations, while also using reasonable defaults as much as possible. Yeah. So the last bit of my talk today, I wanted to briefly mention some work trying to use machine learned interatomic potentials for defects. And so just to motivate why this is, to me, quite an interesting area of research, I'll say that defect calculations are expensive. So we saw earlier how we need to use relatively large supercells for these calculations, and we often need to use high levels of theory, particularly when dealing with these semiconductors or insulators where you might have charge localization at play. So this often means hybrid DFT or even higher level theories. Often we have many different calculations to perform, as you might have multiple different possible configurations, particularly in low symmetry systems that need to be investigated. We saw how structure searching can be important. So, as I say, when we use these coarse numerical parameters for our relaxations, in that case, it does significantly reduce this cost. So it's maybe like 10 to 20%, I would say, the cost of it, of the full defect investigation. And then we've also seen that maybe including metastable states and kind of downstream predictions, so things like recombination and migration processes, is also important. And so combined, this means that defect investigations are often expensive, slow, and limited. And so if we could use machine learned interatomic potentials, it can be trained on a set of DFT calculations and then can reproduce the quantum mechanical energies and forces, this could be extremely useful. Okay, so one way that we looked at doing this before was with my colleague Oscar Louise at Imperial College in London, was taking the M3GNet interatomic potentials, and one of the first versions of these foundation interatomic potentials, and retraining it on a set of ShakeNBreak relaxations. So we first applied ShakeNBreak to a set of neutral cation vacancies in metal chalcogenides, where firstly we found this 35% prevalence rate of significant energy long reconstructions that are missed by standard relaxations. So you can see here on the right, and in many cases these are very large energy differences you get for these particular defects when you use ShakeNBreak compared to just a normal unperturbed relaxation. Then taking the M3GNet potential and fine-tuning it on this set of hybrid DFT relaxations, we then found that it was able to successfully predict these energy-long reconstructions for unseen defects in unseen compositions for 90% of cases here. I will say that this is still, of course, within our chemically constrained subset of neutral cation vacancies in metal chalcogenides, but still, to us, it was quite a promising result, showing that when trained properly and appropriately, and on the right side of data, that these machine learned interatomic potentials could reproduce the behavior we were seeing from high-level DFT calculations. And so we took it as a promising sign for the potential utility of some of these machine learned interatomic potential approaches for defect solids. Okay, before wrapping up, I just want to say that this M3GNet potential was one of the first iterations of these foundation models, but since then we've had much more accurate and advanced models come through. So a lot of these are based on what we call equivariant graph neural network models. And this model, NequIP, was one of the first architectures out there on this, and many different architectures have come since that are in some way kind of based or related to this architecture. But just to mention, we've recently released some new versions of foundation models for both NequIP and Allegro, which you can find on either nequip.net or this MapBench Discovery leaderboard, which is essentially the leaderboard of some of the big models in our field of modeling inorganic materials. So we kind of get essentially near the top in terms of accuracy, and then looking at speed, which is our x-axis here, and our y-axis being accuracy, we see that our models are ending up in the top right quadrant for achieving this good combination of high speed and high accuracy. And so as my last slide, I just wanted to say that there's this study I did recently trying to use some of these models to look at a specific type of defect against some structure searching investigation, in this case for split vacancy geometries. And the short summary is that using some of the geometry tools in DOPE to enumerate all possible split vacancy configurations for cation vacancies in known inorganic solids, that gives you about 200 million candidate geometries using an electrostatic model that reduces to about 1 million candidates, which is then sufficiently tractable to put through one of these machine learned foundation models and combined with DFT, and it can be used to identify tens of thousands of these types of split vacancy configurations compared to about 10 previously known cases of null materials. Okay. Using up too much of my time, but just to summarize, I would say that some key takeaways are that metastability and global optimization is important for defects. Defect energy services can be quite complicated, as we've seen. We propose ShakeNBreak as this accurate and efficient method for trying to do structure searching of defects. I'll say the highest quality software is key to computational research. So we've developed some of these codes like ShakeNBreak. Of course, other people in the field have developed very useful codes like PyDefect from Kumagai Group. And so they really do benefit research and us as a community. And last we saw that machine learning interatomic potentials can be useful for defects. There are a number of different challenges in this area for actually using it more broadly for defects, but when used in the right way, they can be important. So with that, I would just say thank you to my supervisors I've had along the way, both for my PhD fellowship, and I will be starting a faculty position at the University of Cambridge next year, working a little bit in this space. So if you're all interested in that, I have a little bit of a group website there. So that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sean. So, so it's now open for discussion. So, do you have any questions or comments? Also in audience, I mean, in Zoom? No. Okay, so go ahead.
Thank you for your nice talk. And I want to make user-friendly code, and I want to ask you to how did you come up with the software doped design like module?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess you asked me this as we were walking in, but we didn't get to actually discuss. So I would say that it was, I guess, somewhat iteratively refined over the years. So doped kind of started from me mostly just being lazy in my own work and trying to write different scripts to help automate some of the processes of doing defect calculations. Because when I started in the group I was in, the main way of doing it was still the old way. If you manually edit, POSCAR like VASP input files to create the defects, run some scripts afterwards to do finite size corrections. And that was it. So I wanted to speed this up. And so it essentially came from me writing different scripts and notebooks, and then other people seeing that and saying that it would be very useful if I could share that. And so there's this continuous development of it going from something like that to then something that is more usable by other people. So I think, at some point when we really decided that, we were going to try and make this like an actually open source, open to the community code, then we had a lot more kind of time where we sat down and thought about, okay, what's the best way to organize the code? What do we want to be included or not? What are kind of the core features? So I think it was, at that point when we decided that it's going to be a community code, what is the kind of structure that makes sense in terms of like the core parts of the defect workflow. So I guess, some of that we were like, okay, there's the generation module. So you're like initial generation of defects, kind of parsing calculation output files, the input module for just focus on finishing calculation inputs, the thermodynamics one. And so like I said, we just sat down and thought about what makes the most sense in terms of sectioning the code in that way. And so I would say that it's useful to do that at the start and kind of have a clear idea of what the code architecture is going to look like.
Okay, thank
you. So is there any question or comments? So go ahead.
First of all, a really nice introduction as somebody who has only very superficial knowledge about defects. That was very, very helpful. From a crystallographic point of view, I'm kind of curious if you can find all those metastable structures created by those defects. Was there ever like a situation where you were able to maybe explain some confusing XRD results, like some weird peak broadening or satellite reflections or something like that?
That's a good question. I would say that one of the difficult things with this and with defects in general is that often it's very tough to get clear experimental measurements or confirmation of defect behavior. And so often we more, predict downstream properties, like, maybe when we find one of these metastable states and then find the ground state, that it changes the dopability of our material, and that kind of matches experiment better. So this is, it's one of the reasons why theoretical methods are so important in this space, but it's also quite frustrating at times when you have something like this and you say, okay, if you make the method and stuff, then a nice, say, PRL type follow-up is you show it directly, experimental evidence that explains something, which can be difficult at times. So I would say that some of the cases we've seen and that have been found in the literature before have had more direct evidence. So if you've ever heard of DX centers, if you're familiar with them, it was essentially back in the 60s and 70s in silicon and gallium arsenide. You found this persistent photoconductivity behavior. So where you shine light on your material and suddenly it becomes conductive and stays conductive for a couple of days before it eventually stops. And so this couldn't really be explained by any of the known defect behavior in this material. And so they call it DX centers because they thought it was a donor forming some complex with some other defects, so they call it X. And so this was kind of the assumed hypothesis for about 10 years until some theorists did some calculations where they pushed the donor atom to a different site in the material, and you find out that actually it can have this energy low reconstruction and become an acceptor type dopant. And so this was, I guess, one of the first cases of like really seeing this metastability at defects can be experimentally verified. There's been some other cases, but yeah, I guess probably been talking too much. I will say that
that's okay. That's okay.
I will say that that XRD is probably one of the least likely, I would say, techniques for us to really see this in most cases, just because it really requires like nearly percent level concentrations of something to see it at XRD.
Long range order.
Yeah, so you need maybe like ordered defect structures or just an incredibly defective material. Maybe something like some oxides that are super stoichiometric or substoichiometric. But other things like vibrational spectroscopies are often some of the best ways to see this. Particularly if you add in hydrogen and can show that the hydrogen bond would be very different for the different types of defect structures. That's one of the best ways of seeing it kind of directly. Or if you're lucky and your defect is spin active, so has an unpaired spin, then you can do electron paramagnetic resonance, so spin resonance techniques, and then that can be very nice for giving you direct structural information. So we have actually done that in one case with the cadmium vacancy in the -1 charge state. We have this polar on, and you can actually see that directly with EDR.
Yeah, and in common, so the disordered state of the defects is very difficult to observe. Yeah, but in the ordered state, I mean, the ordered defects can be detected from XRD. In normal.
I would expect it to be the exception and not the rule. But if you find something like this, it's like this amazing.
Yeah, exactly. We have direct
indications for
exactly. Yeah.
I see. So thanks. And so is there anyone to have? Okay.
Yeah, maybe XPS also, because the fitting of the XPS is usually very depends on human side. So we need some backup. So if you provide some backup from both experimental side and this calculation side, it will be very helpful for us experimental people.
Right.
Yeah. Yes. You're saying for XPS?
Yes.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, again, it'll still be quite bulk sensitive, but it is in that case also could potentially be useful. The fact that it's so surface sensitive XPS, that particularly to the defect that particularly likes the surface, and maybe you're more likely to see some signature in that.
Yes, I had a question, but maybe the answer is on the paper. So yeah, for the beginner, as when we start, we are always anxious. So is this result okay? So maybe I should read the archive paper published.
Yeah, I guess we try to talk through this one. Some of the key pitfalls we see in the literature of people kind of new to the defects field, because unfortunately, and I guess this is some of this thought in lots of different research communities. There's people who maybe think that we shouldn't be making stuff so easy for people to do. So say with the development of dope or something where we as well as trying to make it very functional, we do actually try and make it relatively easy to use. But then there's some older people, I think, in the field who say that no, it should be hard and people should have to like work for 4 to 5 years before they can actually understand or do any of this stuff. And so we don't think that's the case. We think obviously you should think about what you're doing. But so yeah, so new people in the field do sometimes make different mistakes. Even advanced people in the field do as well. And so we do think it's useful to talk through what some of the common pitfalls are, what to watch out for, and then also here we really wanted to talk about trying to be reproducible, which is something that because there's this long and complex workflow for defects, where there's many different steps and choices you have to make along the way, that this can lead to sometimes not being super reproducible. Also just because it can be a lot of effort to, at the end, when you're writing up a paper, to spend all the time writing in the specific details. And so this is something as well with Dope we've tried to make very easy, where it can automatically output these JSON and CSV files that have all the different information about like processing choices that have been made, in both generating your defects and parsing them to kind of simplify making it fully reproducible.
Maybe when we talk in person the day before, you said there are many warnings. Not many, but there will be warnings. Not to believe it or.
Yeah. So that's another thing that we added into Dope along the way. I guess some of that helped, driven by user feedback. So I had many different people using Dope all through my PhD, which really helped. And so yeah, we have a lot of built-in sanity checks, just for things that are very easy to check that indicate that something is wrong. So things like negative defect formation energies across the entire accessible Fermi level space, which basically is predicting that your material is just going to spontaneously fall apart. Chemical potentials that then don't match the energy of your bulk supercell, checking the consistency of calculation parameters across all your different defect calculations, and those done for chemical potentials, multiple different things like that. So just I guess we found that hopefully that reduces the number of cases of people maybe not realizing something was very wrong with their calculations until the very end, or reducing like the number of questions we get, particularly people saying, your code doesn't work, and then you say, okay, can you show me your results, what's going wrong? And then you see that there's something else very wrong with the results. So we think that is also useful to people as well.
Okay, thank you. So is there any questions? Probably. I think we should go to the next. So, okay, so thank you for your impressive talk, Sean. Okay, so the next presentation will